I'm Israel Naaman from the Naaman Academy. Happy to have you here. And we are going to be discussing today the Islamic slave trade, 1400 years of human trafficking. And this is part of one of the classes we have in our course on Islamic Jihad. And we figured that we would put it out here also for a webinar. So moving right along. As we know, everything that we begin with here, always have to define it and define it well. So first of all, the Islamic Jihad definition, okay, because this is within the framework of jihad, which often is described, of course, as struggle. And we know there are those who talk about it being a spiritual struggle. That's about 2% of all the literature in confronting jihad. When we speak about jihad, it's a military struggle. It's a physical struggle, okay? And jihad of the sword is our issue here. It's military, political, economic, and social. It is all-encompassing, all right? It's exploitation to the end, and slavery is part and parcel to jihad. It's the rewards of those conquests, right? Destruction of subject peoples, and of course, domination or destruction of their religions, cultures, and overall their societies in spreading Sharia law globally, okay? And slavery has been, over the years, a major component. We will also get to it where it is today, and it still exists. Okay, so when we talk about, when we move towards this slavery as a central pillar in jihad, slavery, main principles. And if you take a look on the left-hand side, the picture that we see there is that you have a Meccan Arab master on the right-hand side and a Circassian slave of his. In other words, those issues of race are not significant, not meant to be that way. We'll be seeing where this doesn't always work also. Okay, the Quran does not condemn slavery. It does not seek to abolish it, and there is no issue of racism. Anybody can become a slave, and any devout Muslim can own a slave, or Muslim for that matter. Apologists for Islam, and I've read it, right? They claim that Islam advocates very good treatment of slaves. It's not exactly true. We'll be getting into that also. Women in particular, and here the quote from the Quran, whom the right hand possesses are sex slaves. Manumission, right, freeing your slaves, is considered a virtue, and it is recommended, provided, of course, that the slave converts. But you do not have to give freedom to a slave who's converted to Islam, okay? There are those, right, when we speak about it, they say you must emulate the Prophet, emulate Muhammad, right? Emulate the Prophet Muhammad because, right, he is the one, everybody sees him as the messenger, and that's who one needs to follow. However, in his perfection, right, and he only owned slaves after he had his message, right, as a Muslim, not beforehand. He owned 59 slaves. Okay, moving along. A slave can remain a slave even if he converts, as I said before, and that's significant. Yes, it definitely is recommended to free slaves who would convert to Islam. Okay, but slavery would drive the economy, and we need to point out and be fair, right? We're talking about in the ancient period and in the Middle Ages that slavery drove societies. Look, we know about it from the southern United States as well. Okay, but in this case, that money is brought into the treasury and it will continually fund the next jihad. It's not just specifically for economy, it's part of the overall jihad framework in which to expand. So, the Quran condones slavery when the right hand possesses. In other words, having women as one's slaves, with the right hand possesses and encourages having sex with female slaves. Of course, the population grows that way. And there is this legal foundation. And of course, as we said, this encouragement. And here we have written down the verses from the Quran. Okay, so this is something that does need to be kept in mind because we'll be comparing with others. Okay, slavery, divine right and privilege. You go into verse 1671. Where Allah, it said that he favors some over others, and he gives his gifts, but it's not equal, right? The gifts are given to those whom the right hand possesses and not to those who are the slaves. A slave has no power if we go down 1675-76. And the believer is given all the provisions. One is just, in other words, the believer, and the other is seen as dumb and cannot be equal. Okay, the previous slide was very obvious, right? We saw women who were being inspected to be bought, concubines. And this one, we have the Khartoum slave market of the 1870s, right? These are all, there are tons and tons of sketches and drawings of what we know as very much modern slavery. We're talking 100 some odd years ago. And an African slave boy being punished by an Arab master, which someone actually, in the early days of photography, took a picture. Now, what about slavery in Judaism and Christianity? Because people often say, oh, there are also slavery that's mentioned there. It is true. However, we do need to take a good look at this. In the Hebrew Scriptures, Old Testament, right, Jews, Judeans, Israelites would fall into sort of an indentured servitude or somewhat of a slavery for 6 years. In the 7th year, you had to free that person. It was not allowed to continue. It didn't matter how much money they owed you. It was like being in debtor's prison. Okay? Foreign slaves, and that happens much later, okay? For the most part, right? You could have those in ancient wars that also fell into being forced to serve a master. There are specific rules of buying, all right, selling, and abuse is forbidden, and they had rights. By the way, you also had to give your servants, your slaves, or whatever, Shabbat off, days off or days off, right? Today, it's no longer allowed. It hasn't been allowed now in Judaism for, say, a good 2,000 years. It's true. You had a few here and there who were involved with it, but banned by the religious establishment. Christianity. Slavery existed and is discussed in the New Testament, but it is considered that in the world to come, and that God's looking down, that there is spiritual equality. Not that that particularly helped those who ended up being bought and sold as slaves, and we know that certainly when we go into the development of the New World, but Europe as well. So you had centuries of slavery in North America, which we're all familiar with, but there was also an abolitionist movement that originated from Christian activists who go into Exodus, right, in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, where it speaks of, it forbids man stealing. So there's this whole question, okay, wait a minute. So if someone becomes a slave, very often it was a matter of that person fell into captivity because of war, okay? So they use this man stealing of that, no, you're not allowed to have slaves at all. And that began the abolitionist movement. And we have a picture on the right-hand side of the conference that was held in 1840 in London, where they began a whole process to outlaw slavery, okay? There was a whole a system as such. Now, we know it was condemned, and eventually it was the British who pushed to have it outlawed. On the left-hand side, we do have a picture of a slave trade in Charleston, right? South Carolina. And if we go presently and discuss what is the big issue here between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Judaism and Christianity have banned it, okay? There are individuals who could get involved in it. Certainly we know of in parts of the Christian world, even up till today. But at present, and here I'll read it, certain Islamic societies lag behind in condemnation and enforcement of outlawing slavery. And that's what this webinar is about, right? The history, and then where are we today? So we take a look at what are the functions of slaves in Islamic history. So they did a lot of the construction areas that are captured, destroyed, have to be rebuilt. Of course, working in agriculture is a very important aspect. Domestic housekeeping, we're familiar with that from the New World. And sex, yes, young women, sometimes boys, especially eunuchs, the boys, because we know, and we'll be getting into it, that castration was a big topic within the slavery framework of the Islamic world. And of course, there would be slave armies that would fight. They would convert, be forcibly converted as children to Islam, and they would be in slave armies. And sometimes those armies became quite powerful as well. After all, they knew how to fight. So let's go to the Arabian Peninsula in the 620s. And here are some of the background. In Islam, dhimmis, Jews and Christians, right? The people of the book. It is in Islamic tradition that they should not be enslaved unless the result of a war or if they're born to slaves. And here was the out. In particular, we'll be dealing with the Balkans in a few moments, right? Jews were the first ones of the Dhimmi peoples to become slaves. What happened? When the Beni Koreza tribe, the massacre takes place in the year 627, the last Jewish tribe in Medina, right? 600 to 900 men are slaughtered, and then the women and children are forcibly converted to Islam and enslaved. Okay, some become wives, and those ceremonies are consummated that night. Others concubines, not quite the level of a wife, and also taken to have many children. The most famous one being Safiya bint Huyai. Okay, that she is the one. She's mentioned as a Jewess who's taken in this battle and becomes a wife of Muhammad. All right, there's in northern Arabia Khaybar, the enslavement after their defeat in the year 628, and a pagan tribe that I mentioned down below that was defeated, right? The Bani al-Mustalik, the wives and children are taken. On the left-hand side, a picture of an Ottoman concubine, right, which is much later, of course, in the 1800s. We move on now to the eastern part of Islamic conquest, Hindustan, India. Okay, and here, I don't expect anybody to remember it. Remember this, once again, this class from full course that is given on Islamic Jihad. And I know that when people got to the part in India and I had all these stats because it went for hundreds of years, jihad and abuse, I said, I can't remember all this. Nobody says you have to remember, but just the impression. Muhammad bin Qasim, the first conqueror, who begins in the year 712 till 715, he had 30,000, then 100,000, another 300,000 slaves, Hindu slaves, taken in those 3 years of war. Okay, each time different battles. That's what's reported. That is what was reported in essence by Islamic sources. Then you had a group known as the Ghaznavids, right? The Sultan Muhammad al-Utbi, they record 500,000 slaves, right? And then once again, 750,000 slaves, right? So the ones keeping track numbers-wise are the conquerors themselves. Okay, yes, we do have testimony by those who've been conquered, but much, much less, because they have to flee in order to write about it. And then you have to quote, publish it someplace, and we know history belongs to the victors. They're writing it. Okay, we had the conqueror Ibrahim, 100,000 slaves taken, and Muhammad Ghori, the Ghurids, they speak about 70,000 recorded, and many of the scribes constantly remind us that thousands or tens of thousands are taken here and there. So we know it was much, much more. Constant orders: kill the men and enslave the women and children, take the women to have many, many more children. That's how Islam would develop. It's not just that it spread and people, decided to convert. And of course, the children have to convert, right? They're taken along with their mothers. Okay, so in many places, most of the time, it just talks about, in the thousands and tens of thousands, or many, many, many. So we don't know for sure. There are estimates, and for sure it goes into the millions, tens of millions. And there are Hindu sources that speak of it going into, beyond 100 million. Okay, that overall would be enslaved in one form or another. Go to the Mughal Empire, continuing in the area of Hindustan. You had the famous conqueror Babur, who there's quite a bit written about his enslavement. By the way, starting here in the 1500s, the early modern period. So the records are quite clear and more accurate than previous, right? And that there are big trading centers for slaves, okay, where you'd have massive slave markets in Kabul, right, Afghanistan of today. Before it was captured, it was more of a Buddhist area, and as one went further east, got into Hindu areas, and Kandahar, right, also the areas there of Central Asia, Afghanistan region. You had a liberal, okay, a liberal leader by the name of Akbar. Okay, and by the way, he's heralded by many people who want more of a reform in Islam today. And I'm talking about people who really honestly want to be more liberal and reform, and said we should try doing what Akbar did even under difficult circumstances. He did not want to continue this slavery. He was stuck with it. He didn't want to take any more. However, his generals undermined him. And it said that his general, Abdullah Khan Uzbek, enslaved 500,000, and simply his orders not to do it broke down because the society was used to this and they made a lot of money, of course, right? That was the economy was based on slaves. getting to a very unpleasant topic, right? The castration, child castration, young boys was widespread. There were complete camps set up as such. And it's under this general, Abdullah Khan Uzbek, that this certainly is mentioned. Look, we have Shah Jahangir in 1 year, right? Took over 200,000 slaves and had 1,200 eunuchs. Great. Then there were others, Jahan and Aurangzeb, who were known to be very, very cruel, especially Aurangzeb, one of the later, but considered one of the most famous conquerors amongst the Moghals. Any failure to pay taxes, one was enslaved, and that was it. And of course, numbers here about the 22,000 boys castrated, and of course, he took slaves, as did he who came after him from Iran, the 1600s, Nadir Shah, 20,000 plus slaves. Okay, this is just very, very partial, these numbers, because they go on and on, and you can't just, have a class on statistics, but to give you a feel of what this was like. If there is an Islamic invasion, slavery, and this horrible abuse, and of course, many, many people, especially the men, died, right, because bleeding and infection from the abuse. Okay, we're going to move over to the Balkans, right? There's Christians. And there's this whole aspect, understanding of 1/5 of the spoils, right? We have that in the Quran, chapter 8, verse 42. And we know that that was taken by early Muslims also. 1/5 went to the leadership, 80% went to the fighters. That's how soldiers got paid. And that was pretty much that way in many, many armies at the time. You couldn't really pay your army, so they got plunder. Okay, but it gets used further and for a long time because it's a motivating factor for sure. And the treasury becomes very wealthy. So you had the Sultan Arhan that instituted what was known as the Dervishim. The Dervishim, all right, was a gathering. Now it sounds pretty innocuous, the gathering, but it would be gathering up Christian children. So if we take it that 1/5 of the spoils goes to the leadership, they can decide that when defeating a Christian country, here it was in the Balkans at the time, the early period of the Ottoman Empire, that included children to be taken from the Christian peasantry. Also, in the Christian peasantry, the fathers could not pay taxes. They had to give up a child. Okay, another precedent, right? We have a precedent here of Caliph Omar, who forced the Christian Taghlib tribes, right, that they had to mark their children with crosses and become Muslims. Okay, and this too, right, forcing the population to have their children convert as part of plunder in a way. Again, everybody interprets it this differently, but it really helped the empire expand. Non-believers, right? And by now they're speaking of people of the book, the Christians as non-believers, and in this case, the Balkans, generally Christian boys, they were abducted or had to be sold. They were put in special units. They were converted to Islam. You have the Janissaries in particular, and they were known to be very, very brutal and dedicated to a hardline jihadi Islam, and very often sent to those same areas, regions where their former co-religionists were from. In other words, the towns where they grew up more or less, and to enforce this Islamic rule. Okay, and the coup de grace, as we know, would be when Mehmed II would sack Constantinople in the year 1453. Okay, so let's take a look here at piracy, Mediterranean Sea, Northwest Europe. And we'll see also the Europeans are not particularly innocent. I mean, there are those innocent who become slaves, but there are a lot of slave traders from Europe as well. So it's estimated that 1.5 million Europeans were enslaved overall by these Islamic navies, pirates, whatever. And they had cooperation with the Vikings and other European slave traders, especially in Eastern Europe. We'll get to that in a moment, right? There would be jihadi raids on the coast. It's something to look up. I remember when studying this, you'd go say, what? There were a few raids? No, there weren't a few. You get to Assam, and then there are more, and then there are more. They would simply abduct complete fishing villages in the middle of the night. And by the time the king's army arrived there, villages were emptied and burnt down, looted. Okay? So you had these jihad raids from coastal villages. All right, and I will point out using the blue cursor here from Malta, right? By the way, and in southern Italy, and then making its way France, Spain, Portugal, northern part of Spain and France, Great Britain, right, including Ireland, Denmark, as far north as Denmark, Norway, the coast, and even all the way to Iceland. It shows that the Islamic Navy was very, very proficient. Okay, and they made a fortune doing this. This is what the Vikings did as well, right? Raiding coastal villages. Okay, so we take a look at Africa, right? Islam is very clear. They say there is no discrimination based on race. However, it very often was ignored. And using Ibn Khaldun, who was considered a great historian, philosopher, thinker, you name it, okay, from North Africa, he had this to say when referring to the slave trade. And I quote, "Therefore, the Negro nations are, as a rule, submissive to slavery, because Negroes have little that is essentially human and possess attributes that are quite similar to those of dumb animals." All right, so fairly well-known statement. I saw it in a few places. It's not like I just found it, I did a deep dive. Oh, found it. No, it was known. And the attitude towards African slaves was particularly horrendous. And here we have a sketch of African slave gang. There are quite a few of them by W.A. Churchill from the late 1880s. This is one I put up here. Okay, white slavery, the Balkans and the Black Sea. So this is where you have this cooperation of all the slave traders, where there's money and people are being sold, and we know it today with human trafficking, right? Nobody cares what their background or said to be religion is. Okay, so hundreds of thousands of Balkan slaves from around the year 1350, that's when the Ottoman Empire enters the Balkans, have not yet captured Constantinople, but a massive amount of slaves. We're talking in the hundreds of thousands, as mentioned, okay? Often, where's the biggest slave market? Cairo, in Egypt, because that's where you need the most workers, right? Speaking about in the Delta area and the agriculture, we're all familiar, okay? And you had raids coming out of what is today the area of Crimea, where the Tatars lived, and they too would raid into Eastern Europe, capture people, and sell them, right? The Europeans sold slaves amongst themselves. So there was no great, how should we say, objection to selling slaves from this or that background. Here we have a picture of these Eastern European types, or even Vikings, right, that are selling a slave to Arab Islamic slave traders. So it appears, okay? Or they're bartering there. So we take a look here at Africa, the Jihadi Arab Islamic enslavement. 10 to 15 million black Africans. Now, I've seen some numbers that try to bring it down to 6 million, but they still admit that was the amount. I've seen writings by certain African historians, for the most part, who speak of it possibly going up to 30 million. The issue of massive castration for higher prices. They wanted a very, say, placid type of male slave, not one that could rebel. And therefore, castration, right, just like male animals, the idea was take the fight out of them because of no testosterone, and something like 75% died. So there's this whole question, how many are murdered and how many actually became slaves? So you always have this enormous gap. What it does do is, one, a eunuch costs a lot more because everybody knows that he is not going to, be belligerent. That was the idea. And secondly, the great disaster is that there are no African families, right? The women are sold off to the slave owners, and it's not like they have family units amongst themselves. When you compare it to North America, as horrible as slavery was, for sure, fully condemnable if you want, right? The issue here was that people could put together families, okay? That doesn't exist in the Islamic slave trade for the most part, okay? All right, so you have this total destruction of African life, driving slaves through the Sahara. Sometimes they all died. It would happen over and over again. And we also know with the North American slave trade that there would sometimes be ships that arrived that large percentages of the slaves being transported died. So I've come across, that it could be 50% or more. So these slave traders thought, okay, how do we make sure that less die? Very strange, but that didn't seem to be an enormous concern when we speak about what happened with the Islamic Arab slave trade in Africa, because not like once or twice that the entire group of captives die in transport. And a lot of times it's on foot, as we see here with the picture on the left that was also used in the opening slide. Okay, castrations, and there are pictures of this. I actually looked for pictures of drawings of Africans. This is the one I found. Very unpleasant, but okay. In fact, there are other estimates saying 2/3 died, bleeding, infection, and the whole technical medical explanation of how to make sure that one could still urinate. Horrible stuff. All right, but usually it was spoken of that it were black African boys aged 8 to 12 before puberty. All right, and adult males if they decided not to execute them, so they become eunuchs, and these eunuchs often were in the domestic service of the sultan. Some of them were used in heavier sort of work, but usually those were males who were still intact. Let's put it like that. Okay, eunuchs guarding harems. Now, the Ottoman Empire, right up, and here we have, was the last chief eunuch of the Ottoman Empire, right? How did you know that someone was a eunuch and the women were not to be afraid of him? One, only eunuchs could guard the harems, because obviously they can't do them any damage, and the fact that they were black. So someone just looked at them and knew that he was a eunuch. That was part of this framework that you had in the Ottoman Empire. Now, what does the Quran say? Chapter or Surah 24, verse 31. And here it's, to whom women can reveal themselves, okay? They can get undressed or take a bath, whatever. Those whom their right hands possess, meaning either their master or their husband, sometimes is seen as the same, okay, but it is different, all right? Or their male attendants who have no sexual desire, right? And that was understood to mean that you could have eunuchs, all right? Or children who still have no carnal knowledge of women. Okay, so, a child, 5, 6-year-old male, doesn't matter. So you had tens of thousands of beautiful women who were sold into harem slavery, which we know at times, you see all these drawings and pictures. It seems like they live not such a terrible lifestyle, but remember, they are slaves and sex is expected from them whenever it's demanded. All right, and these harems were only abolished in Turkey with the Ataturk Revolution, 1924, when the caliphate is abolished, okay, and 1952 in Pakistan, right? Also, there were these young, beautiful boys for sex. It's a child eunuchs, right? That's known as well. Let's go to modern times. Slave armies. First, we'll move through the Abbasids and Safavids, where they had these Ghulam soldiers, right? Those were slave armies. Now, they became very powerful armies. They actually were men who all they knew was war, right? The famous conqueror Baibars, who stopped the Mongols right here by Beit Shan in the year 1260, the Battle of Ain Jalut. Okay? He actually fell into slavery at the age of 12 and rose to be chief of staff of the Mamluk army coming out of Egypt. They stopped the Mongols. These were armies that were very brutal because that's all they knew. Okay? So to be a Mamluk meant that you were owned, and from the 800s, you had Turkish tribes that had lost battles and they became slaves, and eventually these Turks also became the Ottoman Empire. Okay, it's a whole different story. So there could be rebellions, and they came to power, like with the Ghaznavids. I mentioned Baibars. And of course, the Janissaries, look, they were a force amongst themselves and within the Ottoman Empire. But still, you're a slave, or you were meant to be. You lived a very brutal life. Okay, you may have made it up further, but not exactly freedom of choice here. All right. The same thing happens in India. And I bring in here the child soldiers of the Islamic State Caliphate, or ISIS, right? Islamic State, Iraq and Syria, that we know of just from a decade ago. And I hate to say this, they'll be back. Okay. They were raising boys as jihad fighters, given by their proud fathers. And of course, I throw in here, when freely, yes or no, they were made into slaves. These children, look at them. Right? They have to listen hour after hour and then train. And we've seen those pictures of Hamas children in kindergartens, right? Already, carrying around plastic guns and knives, and they're going to kill all the Jews. That's, specifically here, Israel deals with, but we speak of the wider Middle East just recently. You have this ISIS, right? And like I said, they'll be back. Okay, let's move over to some European and American history. Beginning in the 16th century, North Africans, pirate navies were continued attacking European civilians and sailors, right? As we said, abductions. But now, on the high seas, theft from merchant ships, as well as taking the sailors into captivity. There would be negotiations to try to get the sailors back. It wouldn't work because you had the North Africans were much more powerful. So often ransoms were paid and very high, and that all it did was encourage the pirates to take more. What we know as the Barbary Pirates. Get to them in a minute. Okay, so it ended temporarily at one point when there were lots of threats against the Sultan, Sidi Muhammad, in 1757, but it didn't last very long. And here we have a sketch of ransoming Christian slaves by the clergy. All right, on the right-hand side, you see a Christian clergyman from the Barbary Pirates. All right, so we're talking about a history now going into the 1800s. And America under attack. 1790, Moulay Suleiman, he restarts the piracy. Okay, and he attacks European ships and the American ships. Now, the United States, for those who are familiar with a bit of American history, its early period, right? They put out some $60,000 to Algeria and Morocco in 1784. Now, remember, there's no president yet. That's under the Articles of Confederation. All right? All right, and the War of Independence ends in 1781. The Americans don't yet have a real centralized executive. So what do? They pay. Okay? Adams and Jefferson, right, both become president, go to negotiate in the 1780s. And they meet with this ambassador, Abdul Rahman of Tripoli. I think they met him in London. And he told them that they must acknowledge that Islam is the true religion. In other words, convert. And if not, you'll have to suffer slavery. And I have nothing to give you. And you are not going to get anything from us. So you're going to fight to the end, right? We're talking jihadis, and it's known. As far as they see it, they'll fight to the end. They'll obtain heaven. And we see that today. We look at Hamas. We look at what's going on with Iran. So what do the Americans do? So eventually they'll strike back. Adams as president, right, from 1797 till 1801. He had one term in office. He lost the election to Jefferson. All right. In 1801, he paid 10% of the United States budget to ransom American sailors. Jefferson said, no, I'd rather build a navy with that money. He's not paying. He sends the navy to Tripoli, right? From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. That's what's being spoken about, right? Those military songs. Okay. Morocco, as a result, declared war on the U.S., and the Americans go for it. Now, I also point out here, because once again, we get into stuff of conservatives and liberals, whatever else. Jefferson was known to be a liberal, as Adams was known to be a conservative, but it doesn't matter. You're dealing with jihadis, so these economic understandings are much less important. It's just who's going to pay and who's not. The Americans win. 1805, no more payment or ransom. No tribute, no ransom. That's it. War of 1812. Right? The Americans fight the British, whatever else. It's seen that they're weakened. And when it ends in 1815, the Algerians declare war on the U.S. They're going to start this whole process over again. And President James Madison defeats them and says, no, we are not paying it. The piracy is over in 1830 when the French occupy Algeria. And that's the beginning of a lot of French involvement in North Africa. People speak about it because, it all gets hidden. It's buried. Call it the political correctness. Is that the French just went and decided they're going to capture North Africa, Algeria in particular. It was the result of them putting an end to piracy in the Mediterranean. Yes, they also had other aspirations. Yes, Napoleon had been there, come and gone, and all right. But there's another element here that is not taught. Just like who studies the Barbary Pirates today and who studies this Islamic Jihadi piracy on the high seas? It's like, try teaching that at a university today. Okay, moving right along. Okay, so the 20th century, slavery is abolished. It's a question mark, but first let's go to the 19th century. And we have here a picture of the slave market in Egypt. I think it may be from Cairo or maybe further downriver, or I should say upriver from the Nile. Okay, very interesting. The Ottomans decided with the Tanzimat reforms that began in 1839, ended in the 1870s, in 1854, they're going to outlaw slavery. There's a lot of pressure from the Europeans, from the United States, to be done with it. Okay? Now, it's interesting. The Americans also somewhat involved, but it's more like coming from those from the North. It's pretty much a European operation at this point. The Americans joined later on, of course. Much stronger demands. Okay, and it's outlawed, but the Hijaz, in other words, the trade route that goes down in the mountain area of Western Arabia, is exempted. That's where Mecca and Medina are. And it said they can have slaves, but they cannot trade. That led to riots, disturbances. They try to throw off, quote, the Ottoman yoke over this slave trade issue because, after all, they make a lot of money. Okay, and here was a fatwa, or an Islamic edict, put out by a scholar in that period of time, right, 1850s. The ban on slavery is contradictory to the Holy Sharia, right? Sharia is Islamic law. With such proposals, the Turks have become infidels. Infidels. Their blood is forfeit, meaning you can kill any of them. And it is lawful to make their children slaves. In other words, I will kill you and take your children, even though you're a devout Muslim, but you're a Turk and you've done this. And okay, see how harsh the indictment is of the Turks. By World War I, the Cairo slave markets were closed. The British had entered Egypt. Whole different story, why and how. All right, and slavery was only legally abolished in Saudi Arabia in 1962, Mauritania, that I have a map on the left, in 1981. By the way, it still exists there. And in Sudan in 2005, where today it still also exists. Coming up to our last, we'll get that in our last slide. So there's always this discussion that the Sufi Sheikhs did not condone slavery. Not true. Today, yes. Okay, today, yes. They're spiritual, whatever else. But in battling the Hindus, because they were seen as pagans, it was a brutal support for jihad, and often they would rally the troops in this jihad and go to slaughter and take slaves. I mentioned Sufi Sheikh Amir Khurso. He really saw the Hindus as the peoples from hell. They said they were polytheists, and writes very laudingly of all the massacres. You had Ghazali, was the greatest of the Sufi ideologues, said to enforce the jizya, humiliation, paying taxes, and go for this jihad and take slaves. Others spoke of Hindus will all go to hell. Something that we don't particularly study. Where do they have courses anymore about, Hindu Islamic clashes? All right, and they supported this. So they were integral to this jihad invasion and the slave taking. They say today, no. Okay, but this too, not particularly no. And then today, slavery, Islamic world, all right, is outlawed, but there's really no enforcement. A picture of Michelle Obama. You remember when you had the girls that were kidnapped in Algeria? Okay, not in Algeria. Sorry, the girls were kidnapped in Nigeria. It was about 10 years ago, right, by Boko Haram, and the history of this is not taught, and it's not particularly condemned. It's what's called a collective amnesia. Nobody wants to know about it. Nobody wants to talk about it. Mali and Mauritania is practiced widely, even though it's considered illegal. There's really no enforcement. We're talking about today, 2026. In the Gulf states, there's another form, what's known as kafala, the sponsorship program. Foreign workers, you've heard about it. How many foreign workers died building all those sports arenas, especially in Qatar before the World Cup. In Sudan, right through the Second Sudanese Civil War, ended in 2003. There was massive amounts of slavery, tens of thousands. The Third Civil War, today, that we hear about, since April of 23, is now 3 years. Continue these abductions. There's really no law and order. Sexual slavery. You have what's known as Christian Solidarity International, that is freeing tens of thousands of slaves here. And yes, Boko Haram in Nigeria, just mentioned them with the Chibok girls. They continue, right? It's less, but it's just as brutal. And of course, the Islamic State, ISIS. We know of the Yazidi women, but the total populations there. And I want to make clear, wherever ISIS goes, slavery follows, or any of those who are like ISIS. Okay, and we could expect a rebounding of many of these very extreme forces. And unfortunately, this does continue in the Arab Islamic world. It's much less percentage-wise, numbers-wise, than had been previously, we know, but it's continued because it's not outright condemned, and enforcement very often is barely there. Okay, so we at the Naaman Academy, right, we educate to safeguard humanity, and we teach about the Islamic Jihad agenda and global anti-Semitism, 2 major courses that we have up and running. Purchase them, go into Naaman Academy. As we say, you'll be empowered through knowledge that you gain from these courses, be able to go in depth and understand the Middle East and what is happening in our world today. That is so important. Okay, thanks. And in a minute, we'll take your questions. But first, we have to put up our credits, right? We use the pictures. All right, and like we said, a couple more words about it. Our anti-Semitism course from Farah to Facebook. We have it's a mini course with 6 parts. It actually breaks down to 10 different topics and 13 different topics, weeks that we have exposing Islamic Jihad, safeguarding humanity. And by the way, as we write here, you really can make a difference, be able to respond, and be able to make it understood that Western society and the values that we hold dear must triumph, because people don't know these histories. Very important that we understand them in depth. So we urge you, purchase, learn, and join us for our discussions that we have with students every other week. So from here, we have our calendar. Today is the 15th. March 22nd, we'll be doing a geopolitical overview of Iran against the world. All right, it's going to be open to everybody. And based on what will happen next week, I'll put together a program and we'll discuss where do we think everything is going, what's happening, where it's going, what are the scenarios, what to expect. Okay? And maybe even how much longer. We're not sure. Okay, so thank you and your questions.